Good afternoon. Today I'm thinking about Ella Fabio. Her birthday is on Easter Sunday. So we're going to read The Sleeping Beauty. It's an old story. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who grieved because they had no child. Finally, a daughter was born, and the king was so happy that he gave a great christening feast. As godmothers for this little daughter, he asked all the fairies, but one to the kingdom. 7 he asked, but the bad temper fairy he left out. He hoped that each, after the fairy custom, will give the princess a gift. From the christening, the company returned to the palace, where a splendid feast had been prepared. Before each fairy was placed a crinkled emerald plate, like a clover leaf, set with diamonds like dewdrops. Just as they were taking their place at the table, in came the cross fairy, who had not been invited. She rode in the hall on a dragonfly, for the slight bad made her crosser than ever. The king had a plate of pure pearl, like a lily petal, and set before her, but she was angrily pushed it away, and looked enviously at the emerald plates. The plates had been made to order for the 7 fairies. The cross fairy thought herself ill-treated, and muttered threats under her breath. One of the wisest fairies, who was seated nearby, heard these threats, and felt sure that she meant to do some harm to the little princess. When the company rose from the table, this wise fairy hid behind a cradle, that she might speak last, and perhaps undo some of the harm which she knew was brewing in the bad-tempered fairy's mind. Now the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her beauty, the next wit, the third grace, the 4th virtue, the 5th a lovely voice, the 6th a smile to win all hearts. Then it was the cross fairy's turn. With her ivory wand, pointed like a spear at the royal baby, she cried out, "The king's daughter, in her rosebud youth, shall prick her hand with a spindle and fall down dead." That's the baby. Everyone fell a-crying with fright at the terrible gift. And as for our poor queen, she instantly fainted away. But just then the wise fairy popped up from behind the cradle and said, "Be comforted, O king. Revive, O queen. My gift is still to come. I cannot undo what this unkind fairy has done. Your daughter will prick her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she will sink into a deep sleep, which will last 100 years. From that sleep, when her dream is over, a king's son shall awaken her." Yet the king hoped that to save his dear child from the threatened evil, so he had all his heralds proclaim that no one in all the country should spin, or even have a spindle in the house, on pain of death. When the princess was 15 or 16 years old, the king and queen went one day to one of their country houses, leaving the princess with her maids. While the maids were enjoying a gossip with the gardeners, the princess went roaming about the palace, exploring one room after another. At last she came to the old tower, and at the top of the tower she found a little room in which an old woman sat busily spinning. This old woman had never heard of the king's proclamation. "Good day, Granny," said the princess. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning, my pretty lass," said the old woman, who did not recognize her. "Well, that is charming," the princess cried. "How do you do it? Let me see whether I can spin." But she caught at the whirling spindle, and because she was too eager, or because their fairy's decree must be fulfilled, The spindle pricked her hand, and she dropped to the floor in a faint. The old woman, greatly alarmed, cried for help. People came running from all sides. Then the king and queen, who had heard the alarm, came too. They knew at once the fairy's evil wish had been fulfilled. They had the princess carried into a most beautiful room, deep in the heart of the palace, and laid on a bed, decked with rose and silver covers. The king commanded that she be left to sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening had come. Now the wise fairy, whose quick wit had saved the life of the princess, was thousands of miles away, but she knew what had happened, and came at once in her chariot of golden fire, drawn by eagles. She was afraid the princess would be frightened. And lonesome if she should awaken all alone in an empty crumbling castle. So this is what she did. She touched with her wand everything and everybody about the palace, except the king and queen. She touched the governess and the ladies in waiting, the gentlemen, the officers and stewards, cooks, guards, and pages. As she touched them, they all fell asleep, not to awaken until their mistress should wake. So that might all attend upon her, it all took but a moment. Then the king and queen, having kissed their daughter, left the hushed palace. The king issued a new proclamation, forbidding anyone to approach its gates. But such laws were not needed, for in an hour there sprung up around the palace a hedge of thorny shrubs, and year by year these grew into trees so thick and high that neither beast nor man could force a way through. The castle itself was hidden. Only the top of the tower could be seen from a distance. On the very day that the 100 years ended, the son of the king then reigning was a-hunting and spied the tower beyond the thorny wood. He asked what it was, and many strange stories were related, but finally an old peasant told him the true tale of the sleeping princess and of the king's son who was to awaken her. The prince felt very sure from this way his heart began beating, and he was the king's son who was to have that wonderful adventure and be set out at once for the wood. And when he reached it, the great trees and the thorns opened up their own accord to let him pass, but closed behind him, so that even his companions could not pass through. He came at last to the courtyard, of the palace, over which hung an utter silence. Nothing living was to be seen, only men and animals in profound slumber. The prince crossed the court and mounted the stairs. In the guard room, fast asleep, the guards stood drawn up in line. Indeed, in every room he entered he found men and women, some standing, some sitting, often with smiling lips, but always with closed eyes. On he went, and onto the very heart of the palace, where in a beautiful room of gold he saw the loveliest sight in the world, a sleeping princess, a statue in rose and silver. So fair, she seemed an angel. He fell on his knees beside her and looked at her in awe. Just at that moment, the enchantment came to an end. The princess opened her eyes and saw her dream before her. She smiled at the kneeling youth and said, "Is it you, my prince? I have waited long." They talked for hours and still had not said half what was in their hearts to say. Meanwhile, everything in the palace waked with the princess, and everyone took up his task just where he had left it. At nightfall, a lady in waiting curtsied to the princess and announced the supper was served. And after supper, there they are. The sun led his bride in her gorgeous robes of 100 years ago to the royal chapel, where they were married by the very person who had married the father and mother of the princess. The next morning, the bride and groom left the palace and passed through the dark, gloomy wood into the bright sunshine of the world beyond. And when the princess turned to look at the castle where she had slept so many years behind, behold, her castle in wood had vanished. So the princess rode with her prince to his father's court, and there they lived ever after, a life as happy as her dream.